My name is Ira Vance, and 5 years ago on a Thursday night in November, I stood in the crowded drop-off lane at Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, thinking I was simply saying goodbye to my husband for another one of his business trips. Quasi looked perfect the way he always did when the world was watching. Charcoal Tom Ford suit pressed to perfection, fresh lineup, leather briefcase in one hand, roller carry-on in the other. That megawatt smile that made investors open their wallets and women forget their husbands' names. To every stranger walking past us, we were the picture of black excellence. The couple everybody posted about with heart eye emojis and captions like couple goals and living our best life. I was wearing a camel coat I'd bought on sale at Lenox, and heels that were already killing my feet. Smiling the tired smile of a woman who had spent the day being the perfect wife and mother and was ready to go home. Take off the mask and just breathe. Standing between us, holding my hand so tightly his little knuckles had gone white, was our 6-year-old son Kenzo. Quiet, as always, eyes too serious for a child who still carried a dinosaur backpack everywhere he went. Quasi crouched down the way he did whenever he wanted to look like the perfect father for an audience, and said, "Little man, you take care of mama for me while I'm gone, okay?" And Kenzo didn't answer. Didn't smile, just stared at his father like he was trying to memorize every line of his face, like he knew he might never see it the same way again. I should have noticed that look, should have felt the way the air changed temperature in the air around us, but I was tired. Bone-deep tired. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying invisible weight for years, without realizing how heavy it had become. Quasi kissed Kenzo's forehead, kissed my cheek, told us both he loved us, said he'd be back in 3 days tops, and then he walked away, disappearing into the river of travelers heading to security. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, and then I took Kenzo's hand and said, "Come on baby, let's go home." We had only taken a few steps down the long concourse when Kenzo suddenly stopped walking, his little sneakers planted themselves on the polished airport floor like he had grown roots, and he looked up at me with eyes so wide and terrified. I felt my heart do something strange in my chest. "Mama," he whispered, voice trembling, "we can't go back home." I laughed at first because children say dramatic things sometimes, and I was tired and my feet hurt and all I wanted was to kick off those heels and pour a glass of wine. I crouched down, in front of him brushing his curls back from his forehead, and said, "Baby, it's late. We're both tired, we need to get you in bed," and he shook his head hard enough that his backpack slid off one shoulder, and he grabbed both my arms with surprising strength for a 6-year-old and said, "Mama, please believe me this time, please." I heard Daddy this morning, he was on the phone, and he said tonight when we're sleeping, something really bad is going to happen, and he needed to be far away when it didn't. He said we wouldn't be in his way anymore, and his voice cracked on the last words and tears started rolling down his cheeks, and I felt something cold crawl up my spine because this wasn't imagination, this wasn't a nightmare, this was my baby begging me to listen, and I had ignored him before. 3 weeks earlier he had come to me clutching that same dinosaur backpack saying, "Mama, there's a black car with no plates parked across the street every night when you think I'm asleep," and I had looked out the window and seen nothing and told him it was just someone visiting a neighbor. 2 weeks earlier he had tugged my sleeve while I was cooking dinner and whispered, "Mama, I heard Daddy in his office talking about solving the problem once and for all," and I had shushed him and said, "Grown-up conversations aren't for little ears, go play." I had dismissed him over and over because Quasi was charming and successful and never raised his voice and paid for everything and took us on vacations and posted pictures of us looking happy, and what kind of wife suspects her own husband of something dark just because her 6-year-old says so? But that night in the airport with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and strangers rushing past us with rolling suitcases, Kenzo looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Please mama, this time believe me," and I saw pure terror in his face, the kind no child should ever have to feel, and something inside me shifted and I said, "Okay baby, I believe you, tell mama everything." He looked around like he was afraid the walls had ears, then pulled me down so he could whisper right against my ear. "This morning before the sun came up, I woke up thirsty and went to get water, and I heard Daddy in his office on the phone, and he was talking low, but I heard him say tonight when they're sleeping, it has to happen tonight. I'll be in Chicago, perfect alibi. And then we won't be in his way anymore," and he said he was finally going to be free, and his voice wasn't Daddy's nice voice mama, it was different, it was scary and cold, and I knew he was telling the truth because Kenzo doesn't lie, he never has, not even about little things like who ate the last cookie or who left crayons on the couch. He is painfully honest. And always has been, and the kind of child who watches everything and says almost nothing, and I felt every hair on my body stand up because pieces started clicking together that I had refused to see before. Quasi had quietly increased our life insurance policy 3 months earlier, saying it was just smart planning for generational wealth, and I had signed where he told me to sign without reading the fine print. He had insisted 2 years ago that we put the house and the cars and the savings accounts all in his name. Only because it helps with taxes, babe, trust me, and I had trusted him. He had started getting angry any time I mentioned going back to work, saying it wasn't necessary I provide for this family. Ira, you just enjoy being a wife and mother, and I had let myself be convinced because it felt easier than fighting. He had been taking more and more trips, coming home later and later, locking himself in his office for hours on phone calls he ended the second I walked in. 2 weeks ago, I had woken up at 3 a.m. to get water and heard him murmuring into his phone, "Yeah, I know the risk, but it has to look accidental, there's no other way," and I had convinced myself he was talking about some risky real estate deal because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. But standing there in the airport with my baby's hand in mine, I looked at Kenzo's terrified face and made the decision that saved both our lives. I said, "Okay, baby, we're not going home." We walked back to the parking deck, hand in hand, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I buckled Kenzo into his booster seat and started the car, but I didn't drive toward Buckhead. I drove the long way around the neighborhood and found a dark spot on a parallel street where we could see our house through the trees without being seen. And I turned off the engine and the lights, and we sat there in the silence, breathing together, waiting. Kenzo didn't say a word, he just stared at the house like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming, and I started to feel stupid. What kind of mother hides in a car with her child spying on her own house like we're in some Lifetime movie? Maybe Kenzo had misunderstood, maybe it was all a big coincidence, maybe I was losing my mind. But then at 10:17 p.m., a dark van with no plates and tinted windows turned onto our street, moving slow, like it was looking for an address, and my stomach dropped because Kenzo had described that exact van, and it stopped right in front of our gate, and 2 men got out wearing dark hoodies, moving like they had done this 100 times before, and one of them reached into his pocket, and I thought, please, God, let it be a crowbar, let this just be a robbery, but he pulled out a key, our key, and unlocked the gate, and let himself and his partner inside our house. Like they had every right to be there, and I couldn't breathe because only 3 people in the world had keys to that house, me, Quasi, and the spare I thought lived in Quasi's locked office drawer, and the men disappeared inside and didn't turn on any lights, but I saw flashlight beams moving behind the curtains, and then I smelled it, gasoline, sharp and chemical, and Kenzo whispered, "Mama, what's that smell?" And I saw the first thread of smoke curling out of the living room window, and then the glow orange and hungry, and the flames exploded so fast it was like the house had been waiting to die, and within minutes, the entire first floor was engulfed and Kenzo was crying silently beside me, and I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my nails left marks, and I realized if we had gone home like I planned, we would be asleep upstairs right now, and those men would have locked the doors, and we would have burned, and no one would ever know it wasn't an accident. My phone buzzed in the coup folder, and I looked down and saw a text from Quasi. "Hey babe, just landed in Chicago, hope you and Kenzo are sleeping soundly, love you guys, see you soon," with 3 heart emojis, and I felt something inside me break wide open because he was checking to see if his plan had worked, and when I didn't answer because we were supposed to be ashes, he would know soon enough, and the fire trucks came, sirens screaming, and neighbors came out in robes, and the dark van sped away, lights off, long gone, and I sat there watching everything I owned turn to smoke, and I threw up on the street, still clutching Kenzo's hand, and he didn't cry out loud, he just held on to me like I was the only real thing left in the world. And I knew we couldn't go to friends because all our friends were Quasi's friends first, and we couldn't go to family because my family was in Charlotte and it was midnight, and we couldn't go to the police because it would be the word of a 6-year-old against a man with the perfect alibi 3 states away, and I had no proof, just the certainty burning in my chest and the smell of gasoline in my nose. And then I remembered the card. 2 years earlier, right before cancer took my daddy, he had pulled me into his hospital room when Quasi was conveniently in the cafeteria getting coffee, and pressed a business card into my hand and said, "Baby, I don't trust that husband of yours. Never have. If you ever need real help, you call this woman, and don't tell nobody, not even me." And I had laughed and said, "Daddy, you're being paranoid. Quasi loves us," and he had looked at me with those wise tired eyes and said, "Love looks different sometimes, baby, remember this number," and I had put the card in my wallet and forgotten about it until that moment, sitting in a dark car watching my life burn, and I pulled out my wallet with shaking fingers and found the card. Z. Aper, attorney at law, and a phone number, and I called it at 12:47 a.m., and a woman answered on the fourth ring, voice like gravel, and honey, attorney Aper speaking, and I said, my name is Ira Vance, my daddy was Langston Vance, he told me to call you if I ever needed help, and my husband just tried to kill me and my son. And she said, where are you right now? And I said, sitting in my car, watching my house burn. And she said, are you safe, can you drive? And I said yes, and she gave me an address in Sweet Auburn, and said, come now, don't stop for anything. And 37 minutes later, I was pulling up in front of an old brick building that looked like it had seen better decades, and a woman opened the door before I could knock. Greylokes, pulled back, wearing jeans and a Morehouse sweatshirt, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, looking like somebody's favorite auntie, who could also ruin your whole life in court if she needed to. And she took one look at me and Kenzo asleep against my shoulder and said, get in here, baby, lock the door behind you. And she locked 3 deadbolts, and led us into an office that smelled like old books and strong coffee, and said, put the boy on the couch, there's a blanket. And I laid Kenzo down and covered him up, and he didn't wake up, just curled into a ball clutching that dinosaur backpack like it was the only thing he had left. And she poured me coffee without asking, and said, sit, tell me everything from the beginning, leave nothing out. And I told her all of it, the airport, Kenzo's warning, the van, the key, the text message. And when I finished, she didn't gasp or cry, she just looked at me for a long moment and said, your daddy was a smart man, he knew things about that husband of yours you weren't ready to see. And she stood up, went to a locked cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and laid it on the desk between us, and said, Langston hired me 3 years ago to look into Quasi's finances. He didn't want you to know until you needed to. And I opened the folder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and saw bank records showing gambling debts, $500,000 to men with names like Marcus and Big Dre, and photos of Quasi leaving underground casinos at 4 p.m., and copies of life insurance policies with my name and Kenzo's, and a $2.5 million payout to Quasi upon our accidental deaths, and private investigator notes that ended with the sentence, subject appears to be planning disappearance of wife and child for insurance proceeds. And I felt the world tilt, because my daddy had seen the monster I married and tried to protect me anyway. And I started crying, not pretty crying, ugly shaking crying. And she let me cry until I was empty, and then she said, here's what we're going to do. She said, tomorrow, your husband is going to put on the performance of his life, crying on television, begging for any sign of his family, and we are going to let him, because panicked men make mistakes, and we need him to make every single one. And she made pallets on the floor in the back room, and Kenzo and I slept maybe 3 hours curled together, like puppies. And I woke up to the smell of coffee and the television showing breaking news: luxury Buckhead home destroyed by fire, family missing, feared dead. And there was Quasi stepping out of an Uber looking devastated, clutching a police officer's arm, screaming, my wife, my son, has anyone seen them? And the reporter said the husband had been traveling on business, arrived straight from the airport, and was desperate for information. And I watched him ask the fire chief 3 separate times, did you recover the bodies yet? With hunger in his eyes, not hope. And I felt Kenzo curl closer to me and whisper, he's lying, Mama, he's pretending. And I held him and said, I know, baby, I know. And Auntie Z, because that's what she told me to call her, said we have 24 hours, maybe or T6, before he realizes you're alive, and then he'll come hunting, so we need to move fast. And she made phone calls in the other room, speaking low and urgent, and when she came back she said, tonight, when he checks into whatever hotel he chooses to play grieving husband at, we're going back to the house and we're getting proof, because right now it's your word and a 6-year-old's against his. And that's not enough. And I said the house is destroyed, and she said not everything burns, baby, some things survive. And she was right. That night, after the news showed Quasi giving tearful interviews at the Ritz-Carlton, wearing the same clothes from the airport because a grieving husband wouldn't have time to change, we drove back to what was left of our life wearing black clothes and gloves and little flashlights. And Kenzo insisted on coming because, Mama, I know where Daddy hides things you don't know about. I watch everything. And Auntie Z looked at me and said, children see what adults train themselves not to. And we climbed the back wall where there were no cameras, and the smell of smoke still hung thick in the air, and the house was a blackened skeleton, windows gone, roof partially collapsed, but the office on the 2nd floor was mostly intact because the fire had started downstairs and spread up. And Kenzo led us straight to a loose floorboard under Quasi's gaves, and inside was a black notebook and 2 burner phones and an envelope stuffed with cash. And I opened the notebook with shaking fingers and saw pages of dates and amounts and names and threats, and on the very last page Written in Quaz's neat handwriting. Final solution. Ayera plus Kenzo accident insurance payout 2. 5 meters. Contact Marcus fee. 50,000 half tonight half on completion date November 21st, and my knees almost gave out. Because today was November 21st. And we stuffed everything into a backpack and were almost out when we heard voices downstairs and hid in the closet. While two men, the same two who had poured the gasoline, came back to make sure the job was done, and one of them saw the open safe and the missing cash and the small footprints in the ash, and said, "We got a problem, boss needs to know." And I thought we were dead, but Auntie Z screamed from the backyard like a woman being murdered, and they ran out to investigate. And we ran out the back and didn't stop until we were locked inside her office again, and she looked at the notebook and the phones and said, "Bingo baby, we've got him." The next morning, Quasi was blowing up my phone. 15 missed calls, 30 texts. "Babe, where are you? I'm going out of my mind, the police can't find you, please answer." And the last one said, "I know you're alive, and I know you took what was in the safe, we need to talk." And Auntie Z said, "Perfect, now we control the board." And she called a detective. She trusted a man named Hightower, who had lost his own sister to a husband who got away with it for too long, and he agreed to help, and we set a trap. I texted Quasi, "Meet me Centennial Olympic Park, by the fountain 10 a.m. Come alone," and he answered in seconds. "I'll be there babe, things aren't what you think." And the next morning, I sat on a park bench wearing a wire while plainclothes officers pretended to sell hot dogs and walk dogs, and Kenzo watched from Auntie Z's office on a laptop feed, and Quasi showed up looking like he hadn't slept, unshaven, wrinkled clothes, eyes wild, and tried to hug me, and I stepped back and said, "Don't touch me," and he started with the lies, saying the loan sharks made him do it, saying he was going to take the insurance money and get us all to safety, and I said, "You mean the insurance that only pays if we're dead?" And he blinked and realized he'd slipped and started threatening, "Give me the notebook, or I'll finish what I started." And that was all Detective Hightower needed, and they moved in, but Quasi ran like the coward he was, knocking over strollers and tourists, and grabbed me from behind and put a knife to my throat, screaming, "Nobody move or she dies." And I felt the blade bite and blood run warm down my neck, and thought, this is how it ends. But then Kenzo's face flashed in my mind, and I said, "You're a coward, Quasi, you always were. Real men don't hire other people to kill their family." And the knife shook in his hand, and in that second of hesitation, a sniper shot his hand, and the knife fell, and he went down screaming, and they cuffed him while he bled on the grass, and looked at me like he couldn't believe I had won. The trial was swift. The notebook, the phones, the texts, the testimony from Marcus, who took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, and Quaz's own words on the wire, "We have enough move-in team," and the jury took 4 hours to come back guilty on every count, 25 years, no parole, and I didn't go to the sentencing. I never wanted to see his face again, but Auntie Z sent me a text, "Justice served," and I cried for the 8 years I lost, not for him. 5 years have passed. Kenzo is 11 now, tall and lanky with his daddy's smile but my eyes, and he builds robots after school and wants to go to MIT, and I went back to school nights and weekends and passed the Georgia bar and became partner at Auntie Z's firm, and we help women who are where I was trapped, thinking love looks like control, thinking silence is peace, thinking children exaggerate when they try to warn us, and every time we get a protection order or help a mother and her babies disappear to safety, I think about that night in the airport when my 6-year-old saved my life by being brave enough to speak, and me being brave enough to listen. And we live in a little blue house in Decatur now, with a porch swing and a garden Kenzo planted, and I still wake up some nights smelling smoke, but then I hear him humming in his room doing homework, and I know we made it. And every morning I kissed the top of his head, even though he pretends to hate it, and every night I lock to deadbolts instead of 3, and whisper, "Thank you for saving us," and he whispers back, "We saved each other, mama," and that is the truth we will carry for the rest of our lives.